Hey guys, how is it going? I realize it's been a while since the last Whisky Byte episode, and it has indeed been a busy month or so with lots of plates spinning, doing lots of whiskey tastings at events, traveling about and so on. And I was busy writing down some other Whisky Byte episodes I was going to do, and I've been busy doing some interviews with some people as well, which I'll talk about in a second. But ultimately, I realized, look at my calendar, that it's coming up for exactly a year since I officially launched myself and my businesses. And I thought this would be a good chance to talk about exactly what it is I do, how I've got here, and a lot of the, I guess, hard and valuable lessons I've learned to get to this point. And ultimately, where this particular chapter started for me was around about the time of lockdown, and up until that point I'd enjoyed a very eventful and crazy and chaotic career and lifestyle. I'd been out living in Australia for 5 years, managing cocktail bars in places like Melbourne, then basically having to leave Australia and go to Spain for 3 years, where I was bartending and working on some online projects and teaching myself graphic design. Then moving to London and being the global ambassador for Jewels for 5 years, traveling to 40 different countries. And basically, I think when lockdown happened, and I guess this happened for a lot of people as well, it was kind of a moment of realization that I needed to do some work on myself to kind of get to the next place I needed to get to. So after a few things that kind of happened in and around things like my personal life, I decided to invest in a course of therapy, which I started in February 2021. And during the following months of mental flossing, as I call it, I decided that I needed to quit my job, leave London, take a bit of time off, have a bit of a mini sabbatical, and kind of figure out what was next. So basically what the next kind of year and a half looked like was going to Portugal for a mini holiday, and then ending up back here in Aberdeenshire, where my family is based, at the end of 2021, and not really knowing at all what the next sort of chapter or, work or role looked like. And I think that there was an element of sort of maybe it was entitlement or self-assuredness that I was just going to walk into the next role, the next job, the next opportunity, and nothing could have been further from the truth. But I also realized, I think, doing that course of therapy, which by the way lasted for about a year and a half, that I really wanted to have my own brand, my own business, and kind of, I guess, be my own boss, because I didn't really fit into the corporate sort of box. So after moving back up here, it was a lot of testing and learning basically over the last 5 years, doing different projects, different roles, different businesses, working with different people. And ultimately, I launched myself a year ago as a Whisky Specialist, brand consultant, and drink strategist. And even in the last year, I've learned a lot about what, that business actually looks like for me, because nowadays being self-employed in this industry, it's not really straightforward, because the industry itself has been through a lot of turmoil in the last few years. So I've realized since moving back up here that the landscape is also very different to other places I've lived before. Even though I'm from Scotland, I haven't lived here for 13 years, and I've had to start from scratch in a lot of ways again with things like my network, which has taken me a while to sort of build up, and looking at the landscape and seeing what the work opportunities, especially trying to stay in whiskey, looks like. And ultimately, this episode is just really sharing some of those experiences and what I've learned and what it is that I do. And I think one of the first things I realized after moving back up here was how different the sort of economy or the industry is up here versus, say, like living in London, in that up here, having been away for 13 years, I was sort of starting from scratch in terms of networking, but also, no one really knows or cares up here what a global whiskey ambassador is, because it just doesn't fit into this part of the world in the same way it does all the major cities I've lived in. And so that was a learning lesson for me. And luckily, one of the first person actually give me work up here since moving back is actually now one of my best clients. So up here, there's a very specific economy of network, and you have to kind of get out your bubble and go networking in different industries. You can't just sort of say, well, I'm going to network here in whiskey events, because it just doesn't work that way. But actually, one of the reasons we started Whiskey Talks back in 2023 in Aberdeen was because there wasn't a lot of those kind of networking events up here for people in the trade, in the industry. So obviously trying to solve that back in the day. And obviously the reason not doing Whiskey Talks anymore is purely because it was one of those situations where there was a lot of spreadsheet time, a lot of emails, and ultimately the brand sponsorship money dried up. So that was also a learning lesson in itself, trying to do that and create somewhere for people to come and hang out who work in the industry and find opportunities and build more of a network. And I think with things like networking events and say like whiskey brand launches, I tend to say yes to most things I get invited to. But what I try and do is bundle together as many things on one trip as possible. So for example, if I'm going to invite to a whiskey brand launch, I'm going to tack on a meeting or something else, or do something for Whisky Bytes to make sure each trip is worthwhile, because things like accommodation and fuel are very expensive. So long gone are the days of having a company card, with an endless T&E on it. So I have to be very selective of what I go to, especially being up in Aberdeen when everything happens in Edinburgh and Glasgow. And I think over the past 27 years, I've seen every side of the coin when it comes to working environments, whether it's working in a bar surrounded by hundreds of people, you're building relationships with your regulars, your bar team is your family, to then going into one of the biggest drinks companies in the world. Again, you've got a team, you've got all these different people in 40 different countries meeting, networking all the time, to then sort of being launched into the abyss of the unknown, being self-employed and freelance, and it being a very, very different experience of working alone, which can be very isolating, especially in this particular era of the last 5 years, I think, where people are struggling with that sense of isolation, things like social media and stuff, and everything being online. So, but then people have been working by themselves for thousands of years, whether they're poets or artists or therapists or late night security guards. I think you have to be good at working alone to do this kind of job. And be self-employed. And actually one of the best bits of training for me to get my headspace right for doing this was actually during my sabbatical, when I decided to walk the length of the country to try and raise some money for MS Society, walking 1,000 miles from John O'Groats to Land's End. And there was one particular day I remember where it was down in England. I'd walked in this field, I got lost, my GPS wasn't working, was covered in nettle stings. There wasn't a pub for miles. I was missing out on a friend's wedding that day, and I was just having a horrible time of it. And I think when you're doing something big like trying to open a distillery, or you're writing a book or anything like that, you have one of those days you go, why am I doing this? And then in that particular moment on that day, I just said to myself, no one asked you to do this. And sort of took immediate accountability for the fact that it was my decision to go on that journey, to walk into that field that day. And that eventually when I got to the end, the catharsis of getting over the finish line and that sort of euphoria of achieving that would have been absolutely crap if I hadn't had those terribly hard days to deal with. And that's what I have to tell myself when you have those days doing this, where it is isolating and you're by yourself, is that will all disappear when you're standing in a room full of people with some amazing whiskies and everyone's having a great time. So that's just the price you have to pay for doing something like this. And I think on the subject of struggling, I think this is why AI is such a contentious topic at the moment, because effectively with AI, and especially things like, say, design, people want the immediate results without having to go through the struggle of getting good at something and doing it, or paying someone to do it. And ultimately, by just getting to the end result, you're not getting that catharsis, that release of having built something, having taught yourself something to be able to do it. You're just producing a result which is quite clearly AI as well, which makes it look terrible. So I do think that without the struggle, it doesn't feel quite as satisfying when you succeed. And so circling back around to what it is that I actually do, when I moved back to Scotland in 2021, I knew, especially after doing that course of therapy, I kind of realized that I wanted to keep talking about whiskey and working with whiskey, having invested so much time in that already, and that I also wanted to use my experience to help brands and businesses in doing consultancy. And so the next step was really figuring out what that looked like in terms of the big picture. So there was a lot of testing, learning, working with different people, trying to find clients, and obviously working with various people and learning some pretty hard lessons while doing it. And where sort of, I think my first invoice just said drinks brand and consultant. And then my official business name since launching last year is my name, Whisky Specialist, brand consultant, drink strategist. And even since doing that, I've had to sort of create sort of the sides of my business and what that looks like and how to present it to people and for different clients and different audiences. And so really after launching, the first thing I focused on was building things like the whiskey tasting side, because I know, having moved back up here, that is where a lot of the work is. A lot of high-end tourism, people coming from the States and Canada, looking for experiences when they get up here, because it is very much a tourism industry up here. So that's probably about 80% of my work since I've moved back, is doing tastings which last an hour over 5 different whiskies for different people in Aberdeenshire or further afield. And I love doing those, but they're also very short spaces of time to spend with people. Like I'm driving out maybe an hour and a half in the countryside, setting up the tasting, doing the tasting for an hour, and then I never get to see these people again. So you don't get to build a lot of relationships really by doing this. So then launch one for the roads in February, which is a collaboration with Macaulay's private chauffeur company based here in Aberdeen, to be able to host single day and multi-day trips and whiskey experiences based out of Aberdeen in the northeast of Scotland, taking people around, showing them the best distilleries, the best experiences, bars, restaurants, hospitality, and so on. So those are basically the two parts of the whiskey experience side of the business. And then the consultancy side, which is really the first thing I launched, has been where the hardest lessons I've probably learned in terms of working with different people and a lot of the false promises you get, bad communications and so on, and having some pretty negative experiences, to be honest, having to take someone to court for not paying invoices, which took 6 months out of my life, which was very draining. So having everything in writing is absolutely paramount when it comes to working these projects, making sure there's no doubts about what everyone's supposed to be doing, roles and responsibilities and so on. You live and learn though. And it's probably been the most inconsistent side too. But I have done some very fun projects. Probably the best one since moving back to Scotland was getting to go out to Puerto Rico and work on a bar build over the space of a month, getting to go back to my second home of Barcelona to do some research, and then traveling out to Puerto Rico to put the bar together and do some training for the staff. So that was a lot of fun. So there have been some good ones, and I'm about to start a new project, which I can't talk about at the moment, but that's going to be a really exciting one too. So, and then the third thing really is the education side, which is this here very channel, Whisky Bytes, which obviously I launched at the end of last year in November. And again, it was really to keep that narrative going about whiskey and all the sort of, I guess, in-depth geeky side of things for people who work in the trade, like bartenders or people who talk about whiskey, people who work in whiskey, or just want to know more about whiskey. And again, this is a project which is very time consuming to film and to edit and to create the episodes, and hence why for the past month I haven't been able to do much with it because I've been so busy and I've just had a lot of things taking up my time. But again, it's also something which helps me in my situation of being a freelancer working solo to reconnect and get to go and visit people and do things like Q&A, a quick bite with, which is the new part of the channel where I'll be speaking to people in the industry, doing 15-minute sort of Q&A sessions to find out what's happening in their jobs and their roles and shining a light on all the amazing stuff they're doing too. So I'm excited to keep going with all this stuff as well. And again, sharing some of the stories of my experiences with you guys who are also in similar positions, maybe working freelance as whiskey specialists or similar. And, you know, I think that this is a growing thing where there's a lot more of us out here now, having worked in brands maybe for a while, and then there's a lot of layoffs at the moment. There's a lot of people going into this not really knowing where to start. So I'm always happy to offer my time doing mentorship for other people in the industry too, to give them some advice. So, you know, this is kind of where I've landed, but also I think ultimately, you know, you can't do this totally alone, even though you are working alone a lot of the time, without all the help from like my immediate family, from friends, from whiskey brands, from people, fellow freelancers, people invite me to events, people just asking to meet up for coffee or go for a dram. All of these things are absolutely paramount and basically couldn't do this without all of that. So thanks to everyone who has helped me over the past year since I really sort of went for it. And ultimately, again, when you do something like this, you take on any endeavor and something off your own back, you do just have to remind yourself that it was your decision to do it. It was your idea to go for it. And you have to take accountability and responsibility for every single decision you make in and around what your business and everything is going to look like. So I guess the only thing I'll finish on saying is that I think the reality in this industry is that no one cares if you don't turn up. They just remember the people that do. Cheers.